everyone, and welcome to our first flipped classroom lesson. The plan here is that you will actually watch these lessons from home and then come to school with your questions, and we can actually do more of the work together in class and less of the teaching aspect in terms of like the lecture. Our lesson today is on who studies science, and we're actually going to be looking at some of the faces behind the science that we now know today. When you think of a scientist, what do you typically think of? Well, our stereotype for scientists, meaning the first image that comes to mind, is typically an old white man who may study chemistry, astronomy, or even psychology. Some of those common examples include Thomas Edison, Ben Franklin, Galileo, Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, Alexander Graham Bell and his telephone, Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, Louis Pasteur, and B.F. Skinner. Really, the one thing all of these scientists have in common is that they're old white men. The point of today's lesson, however, is to learn that anyone can be a scientist. You don't have to be an old white man to study science. And we have some excellent examples for you today. And I really think you're going to find these women and these African American scientists quite inspiring, as I do. One of the most inspiring female scientists is Maria Winkelmann. She was born in 1670, and she was an astronomer. She didn't go to college, but she was actually taught by her father and uncle, who thought that women should have an education. Margaret Cavendish, she was actually before Maria Winkelmann, and she was born in 1623. She actually wrote about the scientific method, and she was one of the first to express concerns about animal testing. Maria Marion, she studied botany and zoology, meaning that she looked at plants and animals. She also studied insects, and one thing that's really neat about her, she was an illustrator, and it was really, really odd for someone, especially a woman, to actually draw bugs. But that's what she did way back in the 1700s. Then you had Maria Mitchell. She was an astronomer as well. She actually discovered a comet in the 1800s. Now, she actually grew up in a Quaker home, and a Quaker is a type of religious group, and her parents, who were Quakers, believed that all people, even girls, had the right to an education. Emmeline Roberts Jones. She was actually born 1836. She was the first woman in the United States to practice dentistry. Now, here's an interesting story about Emmeline. Her husband didn't think it was appropriate for a woman, to practice dentistry. So she actually practiced behind his back, and she pulled numerous teeth. And then one day, when she was finally fed up with him saying that women couldn't study dentistry, she presented him with a jar full of teeth, as if to say, "See, I can do it just as well as you can." E. Lillian Todd, she actually designed her own aircraft. She was born in 1906. And then Sally Ride, she was actually the first American woman to fly into space. Unfortunately, even though we have all of these examples of women in science, it's not very common for women in science to be linked together. For example, this quote states that it's not very often that words like women, science, and leadership are combined together. Since the dawns of time, science and leadership roles have been reserved for the male counterparts, for the boys. Boys play with trucks and girls play with dolls. To like math and science is considered a masculine feature, meaning it's more for boys, while the love of art and music is considered feminine, meaning it's more for girls. I don't necessarily buy into that kind of thought because I myself am a female scientist. The quote continues, among 770 Nobel laureates, only 34 are women. 12 in the categories of physics, chemistry, and physiology or medicine. That makes less than 6% of all Nobel Prize winners. So these are people receiving prizes for their work in science. Only 6% are women. This quote indicates that women still have quite a ways to go in their study of science. And there are still boundaries that are keeping women from the scientific profession. But really, there's no need. Women have every right to be studying science as well. Unfortunately, however, women's roles have kind of tied them to the home or even the arts. This quote actually reads, "The history of women's participation in science and math is a history of struggle for access. For many years, women's social roles have mainly been limited to childbearing, so having children, and less to professional roles. Even in our modern societies, there are still pressures that discourage women from a career in basic science." There were also quite a few African American scientists who really, even though typically at that time African Americans were slaves, these men and women were they performed above that status, and they were really tremendous scientists. George Washington Carver, for example, he was an agricultural scientist in the 1864, or that's when he was born, to the 1943. He actually came up with an alternative crops to cotton, one of which was peanuts, and he actually developed 105 food recipes using peanuts. Benjamin Banneker, who was born in 1731 and died in 1806, he was an astronomer and an almanac writer. Charles Henry Turner, a very interesting man, he was an entomologist. He actually proved that cockroaches learn by trial and error, honeybees can see color, and that insects can hear. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, he was a surgeon. He was actually the first African American cardiologist or heart doctor, and he started his own non-segregated, so meaning both blacks and whites together, his own non-segregated hospital in the United States, actually in Chicago. There were a few women who also studied, a few African American women who also studied science, although it seemed far more rare, again because of their status as slaves. For example, Sarah Good, she was born a slave, but after the Civil War, she moved to Chicago, and she became the first black woman in the United States to receive a U.S. patent for her invention. You can kind of see her invention there off to the right. She actually created a bed that would turn into a desk. Very clever. So really our takeaway message today is that anyone can study science. It doesn't matter your gender, your race, your religion, sexuality, weight, height, it doesn't matter. Anyone can study science. You saw many examples today of women who study science, of African Americans who study science, and they're just to prove that anyone can study science, including you.